So I titled this talk, The End of the World Water Scarcity. And I thought it was kind of funny, but when the college made a poster for me, they kind of changed the title to Understanding the Global Freshwater Crisis. I think they thought that maybe my original title was a little overdramatic, but I guess we'll see if that is the case. There we go. So just want to make sure everybody, maybe I'll mute everybody. Okay. All right, so in this talk, I'm going to first talk about why water matters, why it's so important to us, and then I'm going to talk about the state of our oceans, like how our oceans are doing, the state of our freshwater bodies. Then I'll get into a big question, which is our use of water sustainable? And last, I'm going to go through some proposed solutions for the water crisis that I don't think will be super effective. And lastly, we'll talk about what would actually help to solve this crisis. So why is water so important? Like all life on Earth, I would say we're as much water-based life forms as carbon-based. Like all living things, their bodies are made predominantly of water, from plants to animals to fungi, even in bacteria, are water on the inside. Fundamentally, we're 60% water by weight. We're something like 99% water by molecule, and we have to consume 3 to 5 liters of water per day to stay alive. We're not like a specialized desert animal that could survive, months without water. Even if you look at us on a cellular basis, our cells are basically soups of organic chemicals dissolved in water. And our fundamental membrane around those cells is based on the existence of water inside the cell and outside the cell. That's what creates the membrane to begin with. Now, we lose water every day through our kidneys, which removes waste products and excess salts. Through our lungs when we breathe, we're always breathing out water vapor. The reason why you can see it when it's cold is because that water vapor, which is a gas, turns into little water droplets when it's really cold, because it cools down. And we lose water through our skin through evaporative cooling. And maybe a lot of people don't realize this, but this is actually a uniquely human trait. We're the mammal that has the most sweat glands covering our skin. Other mammals cool their bodies down in other ways, but we're the only mammal where a whole skin is covered in sweat glands, so we can cool ourselves down relatively rapidly. They do. A lot of other animals sweat, but if they have a lot of fur, that kind of takes up space, so they don't have as high density of sweat glands as we do, because we're relatively hairless compared to most mammals. And without water, humans will die within 3 to 7 days, depending upon the environment. So as you see, water is really important for our basic survival. Besides just keeping us alive, water is used by people for a lot of different functions, from cooking food, bathing, cleaning, and in Arctic regions, building houses. They actually build houses out of ice and snow. Like an igloo, you're making a house out of water. So there's a lot of different functions in people's lives for water. And a lot of people get their food primarily from water. Like rivers, lakes, and the ocean, that's not just a collection of water molecules. There's a lot of life in there. And for people who live close to water bodies, commonly, the water is their source for much of the protein in their diet. In fact, more than 3 billion people around the world rely on fish for much of their protein intake. For like 25% or more of the protein that they take in comes from fish. So water is not just important as a source to drink, but it's important for people to have healthy ecosystems of water, where there's animals and plants that we rely upon. For large-scale agricultural societies, massive amounts of water are required for the irrigation of crops. And this is just showing you this graph, this figure on the right is showing you countries by how much irrigated land area they have. So some countries like the United States, like Brazil, China, and India are covered in agricultural land, which is irrigated by massive amounts of water. In fact, in the United States, 37% of all water usage is specifically for irrigation of crops. You can see the breakdown here on the left, 37% for irrigation, 41% is thermoelectric, which is a fancy way of saying power plants. So providing water to become steam to generate electricity. 12% is public supply. That would be like having, reservoirs and lakes, that sort of thing. And you can see 5% industrial, and then 5% is a bunch of little things. In terms of the world, 70% of all water usage is specifically for irrigation. So water is deeply tied to food production. We use most of the water in the world is used specifically for generating crops. For large-scale industrial societies like in the United States, we use large amounts of water in power plants. If you kind of study how power plants operate, and this is also true for nuclear power plants, they're basically like fancy steam engines. So if you look on the left here, that's showing how a steam engine locomotive works. So like number one there, they're loading coal and burning it. And when you burn coal, that releases a lot of heat. And that heat is used to heat up water and turn the water into steam. And then the steam builds up to really high pressure. And it gets so much pressure that it ends up pushing this bar here called a piston. And when the piston moves, the piston's attached to the wheels of the locomotive, and it gets the wheels to turn a little bit. And then that high pressure steam is released out of the top. You see the steam kind of coming out of the top of the locomotive. The bar gets pushed back, and then the whole process starts again. So that's how water heating up and turning into steam is used to generate mechanical energy in a locomotive. But it's kind of exactly the same thing in a power plant. So in a power plant like this coal power plant on the right, coal comes in, it gets heated up, and that energy that's released is used to boil water into steam. And the steam turns this apparatus called a turbine. And as the turbine spins, it's attached to a generator and these little magnets. In fact, they're actually oftentimes very large magnets. And the magnets spin. And when magnetic fields spin, that creates electrical current. And electrons will leave on a wire. So that's how coal is burned to generate electricity. But as you see, you need massive amounts of water for this because you keep boiling water and releasing it into the air. Same thing happens in a nuclear power plant. They're just heating up water by the breakdown of uranium instead of by burning coal. In fact, all forms of energy basically work like this except for solar panels. But all the other forms of energy involve spinning something that spins some magnets, and that's how it generates electricity. You can also use the power of flowing water more directly to generate electricity through hydroelectric power. So you can have a dam that collects a lot of water behind it, and as water flows down through like a little tunnel in the dam, it again spins a turbine. This time it's just the power of the flowing water that spins the turbine. And then the turbine is connected to magnets and thereby generates electricity. Other major uses for water in industrial societies include mining, manufacturing, fracking. And if you don't know what fracking is commonly used to get natural gas out of the ground. It's also commonly used for geothermal power. But they basically inject liquid, dangerous liquid, down into the earth to break up rocks that contain deposits of natural gas. And then as they break up, the gas comes up and they can collect it. But that uses a ton of water that they have to inject into the earth, and then it basically becomes unusable wastewater. And as you can see, individual fracs, how much they're injecting at once, are becoming more and more massive as time goes on. So fracking uses a lot of water. More recently, there's been the rise of huge buildings of computers called data centers, especially for information processing like AI. And as you can see on the right here, there's been this tremendous rise in the consumption of water specifically for these AI data centers. One data center alone can use as much water as a small city. So this is a huge footprint in terms of water consumption. So something to think about with regards to depending so much on AI. Water is so important to people around the world that if you look at populations everywhere, most people are really close to water. In fact, 90% of the global population is within 10 kilometers of a freshwater body, and 50% are within 3 kilometers, where you could just easily walk to a lake or a river. This figure here is showing the median distance of populations to water. So you can see for most of the world, it's kind of got this dark color, which shows people are very close to water. The few major exceptions are the deserts of the world, where people, even if they want to be close to water, they can't, because there just isn't that much water in those locations. So for most purposes of water we rely on, we need water to be both plentiful and clean. So let's look at what is the state of the world's water supply. How are we doing at maintaining the cleanliness and the abundance of water that we depend upon? So I think to understand how our water is doing around the globe, it helps to divide this up a little bit. So we're first going to consider the state of our oceans, and then we're going to look at the state of freshwater bodies. And this is just a map that shows the oceans and the major lakes and river systems around the world. So one huge problem that's becoming worse and worse every year is plastics. We've become increasingly reliant on mostly non-biodegradable plastics, and this has led to an epidemic of plastic pollution in the oceans. It's estimated there are more than 171 trillion plastic pieces polluting the oceans, and each year get more and more added. In this graph here, you can see this is showing the global mass of floating plastics, and there's just been this continuous rise especially from the 2000s. And there are some regions that are especially full of plastics, in particular the Mediterranean Sea and the Yellow Sea next to China. Because of how currents work, a lot of times plastics accumulate in one spot. An example of this is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is basically a collection of mostly microplastics that are too small to see with the naked eye. But there's a huge mass of microplastics right here, like the size of a medium country. Oceanic plastic waste is very dangerous. It's known to kill or harm hundreds of different marine species. So 90% of sea turtle species are known to be harmed by plastic. And about half of known marine mammals and oceanic birds are damaged by plastics each year. Plastics can do a lot of damage in different ways. They can trap animals, like this sea turtle that luckily was rescued from some plastic fishing nets. And it can also damage their digestive or respiratory system because a lot of animals swallow them on accident. So this seabird here swallowed a lot of plastic waste that basically clogged up their insides, their digestive system, so they died. Animals can even be poisoned by microplastics if they get enough of it in their bloodstream. Besides plastics, one of the most impactful forms of oceanic pollution is from oil spills. And oil spills occur when you have an oil tanker that capsizes, or pipelines leak into the ocean, or in the case here of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, an offshore oil rig explodes. Some of you are maybe old enough to remember the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that exploded and leaked out oil from deep in the ocean for months before it was kept. because the oil companies were capable of building this oil rig, but they were not capable of shutting it down if there was a leak at the bottom of the ocean. This is a map showing the major oil spills around the world. You can see a lot of them are close to the United States. We have quite a few of the top 10, including the Deepwater Horizon is one of the largest oil spills to occur. Oil spills can cause a lot of catastrophic environmental effects. The oil itself is extremely dangerous. It kills animals, it covers their body, makes it so they can't move, can't breathe, it poisons them. But also the chemicals that oil companies use to disperse the oil is also toxic and can cause damage to animals. And it's not just a, Yes, because I don't want to be too dismissive of their efforts. But a lot of times when oil companies are trying to clean oil spills, it seems like what they really want to do is to give the appearance that the oil spill has been cleaned. But what they're really doing is they're breaking down the oil into tiny little droplets that tend to sink. And it remains in the ecosystem for years, for decades, continuing to harm wildlife. So scientists have found that after the Deepwater Horizon, it continues to have a negative effect on wildlife today, like 15 years after the explosion and oil spill occurred, because it persists in the environment, even if it's not obvious, because it's not floating on the surface. So I don't know if it's actually valid cleanup procedure to use these dispersants. I don't know if they actually have a net positive effect. Another major category of water pollution is fertilizer runoff. So as I'll show you in another graph, people increasingly use large amounts of fertilizer on agricultural land. A lot of this is because our large-scale industrial methods of agriculture tend to degrade soil over time. So soil becomes less productive, so we end up dumping more and more fertilizer to just boost up productivity in the short term. But fertilizer is made to help plants grow. It gives them nitrogen and phosphorus and different chemicals that they need. So if this fertilizer runs off into a river or a lake or into the ocean, it also helps algae to grow. That's called eutrophication. And that might not sound that bad, but it has a lot of dangerous effects. So here are some examples of very large algal blooms. This is an algal bloom of green algae from the Yellow Sea in China on the left. And on the right, we have red tide algal bloom in New Zealand, which is caused by a single-celled protist called a dinoflagellate that blooms in the ocean. So sometimes the problem with these algal blooms is that the algae itself can produce toxins. And that's the case of the red tide. The dinoflagellates, when they become numerous, they release toxins into the environment that poisons everything around themselves. So it can cause a massive die-off like these rock lobsters on the right. But usually the problem isn't with the algae itself. There's so much algal growth and most of it can't survive in the long run. So as the algae kind of sinks to the bottom, it gets decomposed by bacteria. And as the bacteria break down the algae, the bacteria use most of the oxygen around themselves. And they end up creating a region of water that has no oxygen. So anything in that water that needs oxygen to survive will die. That's called a dead zone. So that's like what caused this fish die-off in Iowa, was this dead zone created from the breakdown of algae. And like I mentioned, in a lot of parts of the world, we are increasingly using fertilizer to ramp up food production, but this has led to more and more algal blooms, which harms not just wildlife, but also people, because if people consume, poisoned fisheries, or if they're in the water, they can get damaged by the algal bloom. So this is an example again from China, but the black bars show the rise in fertilizer production in China. So there's been an increased use of fertilizer, and then these little circles are the incidence of algal bloom. So you can see as they've had more fertilizer, there's been a steady increase in the rate of large-scale algal blooms as a result. Let's talk a little bit about climate change. So hopefully this isn't too surprising to people, but us burning fossil fuels on a large scale has caused the world to become warmer. And not just the land, the oceans have also become warmer. And not only are they warmer, but they're also more acidic. And it's kind of a simple reason. If you have more carbon dioxide in the air, that carbon dioxide dissolves in the water as carbonic acid. So the oceans are getting warmer. They're also becoming more acidic. But this is a problem. Warm acidic water is dangerous for corals, especially for the algae that live inside the corals that give them most of their food. Because although corals are animals, they're in a fairly permanent symbiotic relationship with algae that lives inside their bodies. And although corals can feed, the vast majority of their nutrition comes from the photosynthesis provided by the algae. So as the algae dies or leaves their cells, the corals themselves die. And you're left with just their shells, like this picture on the right. That's called coral bleaching. So when this occurs, we're destroying what's really the most diverse marine habitat on the planet. And this is what's been happening. So from 2009 until 2020, the world's lost about 14% of its coral reefs due to climate change. And on the right, you can see a breakdown. This is showing how much coral reefs there are in different parts of the world. And then that red circle is showing how much they lost during this time period. So you can see some regions like South Asia has lost 21% of their coral reefs. In Australia, they've lost 10% of the Great Barrier Reef due to coral bleaching. On the left, this is a graph showing the susceptibility, the probability of coral bleaching events for this time period right now. So I just got this recently. You can see there's a high risk of coral bleaching occurring around Australia again. So it's kind of a bad situation for coral reefs. And biologists estimate that 25% of all marine life depends on coral reefs. That's how diverse they are. 25% of fish, of marine invertebrates, are found specifically in that type of community. So let's summarize this for the state of our oceans. Over time, humans have dumped into the ocean an increasing amount of trash and pollutants that's harmed wildlife as well as our own food supply, because we depend frequently on healthy fish and healthy marine and freshwater animals for our own food. Climate change is putting huge stresses on corals, leading to regional collapse of coral ecosystems, affecting many kinds of marine life. So I would say overall, we've not done a very good job taking care of our oceans. So let's take a look at our freshwater supplies to see if they've fared any better. So as with the oceans, our freshwater bodies have also been contaminated with plastic and other forms of trash. In kind of city planning, this is called municipal solid waste. And this map is showing kind of the amount of municipal solid waste and kilotons around the world. So if it's red, that means there is a higher density of this waste. Although a lot of this waste, as you can see, most of the red here comes from Asia and Africa, but other parts of the world, including the United States, have really high amounts of this trash runoff as well. You can see this is the Mississippi River here, and this is the Missouri River coming off here. Extremely polluted. Very high amounts of waste in those river bodies. The Amazon is also suffering from this kind of waste as well. So this is fairly a global problem. Burning of fossil fuels doesn't just warm up the earth, it also releases chemicals into the atmosphere, like nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide, that can change into acids when they're in the air. And then they can rain down on the earth as acid rain. So for example, if you look at the United States, the eastern half of the United States is where we have most of our coal plants. See, so this is coal plants on the right. You can see a whole bunch of coal plants here. Western side of the United States, not nearly as many coal plants. And it's not a mistake if you look at this map here on the left. This is showing the the average pH of rainfall, of precipitation. So on the left side, we have pretty good rainfall that tends to be close to neutral pH. But if you look at the region where there's the highest concentration of coal plants, you can see very acidic rainfall, like almost as low as 4 pH. And I think sometimes when I teach environmental biology, students get this idea that acid rain will like melt their skin or something. It's not that acidic. It's not as acidic as like lemon juice. So the danger isn't really that it's going to harm you if it rains on you. The danger is what happens when this water accumulates. So if acid rain comes down, it will accumulate, for one thing, in the soil. And a lot of soil organisms can't tolerate really acidic conditions. So the acids will kill bacteria, they'll kill microscopic organisms, they'll kill microscopic animals that live in the soil. And when that soil ecosystem dies like that, when it's so affected, that affects the plants, because the plants need that soil ecosystem to get them nutrients, to provide them with access to nitrogen and other nutrients that they need. So when acid rain comes down and kind of ruins the soil, this can kill whole forests. Like this is a forest in the Czech Republic that died from acid rain because of its effect on the soil. Acid rain will also tend to settle down, go down into water bodies like lakes and rivers, and it'll make lakes and rivers more acidic. And this is a really big problem because a lot of freshwater organisms are very sensitive to pH. So this is the critical pH level for some common aquatic organisms. What this means is if the pH dropped, so let's say it was like 5.2, then everything above this point will die in the freshwater body. Snails, clams, bass, crayfish, mayflies are gone. If the pH drops to like 4.7, now you're losing all of them, plus trout and salamanders. So frogs are pretty resilient, but if you get a really acidic freshwater environment, you could even lose frogs. So that's some of the big extreme environmental impacts of acid rain. In terms of human health, if we're looking specifically about humans, the most important, the most dangerous form of water pollution is when human waste, when feces gets into freshwater bodies, because this can allow the proliferation of waterborne pathogens like worms and bacteria. So if we look at this life cycle of the human liver fluke, which is a flatworm which infects people. So liver fluke kind of lives in people's livers. It sends the eggs down with the feces. And if eggs go in the water, the eggs get swallowed by a snail. And then they metamorphosize into this nasty looking stage here. And that stage burrows out of the snail's body. And it swims and it burrows into the flesh of a fish. And then if someone takes that fish and they eat it without cooking it all the way through, then that stage, which in the fish is like a little protective shell, it'll go in their body and our digestive system wakes it up out of the shell, and then it will infect another person. So for this liver fluke to spread from one person to another, what you need to have from the liver fluke's point of view is a connection between where the waste is going and where people are getting food. You have to have where human waste is going be the same place where people are getting fish. Okay, so that's the important issue with regard to this type of pathogen. And unfortunately, that's the situation for a lot of people. Globally, about 2 billion people, or 24% of the world's population, drink water potentially contaminated with feces. And this is especially true in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. This is a map showing regions where they don't have access to improved sanitation, where human waste isn't treated and then carefully brought back into the water supply. You can see really high amounts of this, especially in India and China, Southeast Asia, and some parts of Africa. So that's showing people that don't have access to improved sanitation. If you compare this to this figure, this is showing deaths associated with having unsafe water. deaths from pathogens passed on through the water. These are the same regions where human waste can get into the water supply. So we have a lot of deaths from unsafe water in Africa again, India, Southeast Asia, South America. So there's a big overlap here. The areas that don't have improved sanitation, where waste gets into the water supply, are also tend to be the areas that have the most deaths from waterborne pathogens. And it's a lot. There's about 2 million deaths per year from diseases like this spread through the water supply. It's estimated that 1.5 billion people right now are infected with parasitic worms around the globe. In fact, 1 billion of it is just this one worm, the most common type of infectious worm around the world, which is Ascaris. So Ascaris is shown here on the left. And again, if we look at the life cycle, how Ascaris reproduces, Ascaris lives in people. The eggs go out with the waste, maybe just some carrots. And then if the person eats the carrots, then it goes into their body and infects them. So again, you have to have that where the food comes from is the same place where the human waste is going. That's what spreads Ascaris. You can also have a lot of deaths and infections from microscopic organisms that can contaminate the water supply. Two of the biggest microorganisms for causing death through the water supply are rotavirus and Shigella. Rotavirus, as the name implies, is a virus, and Shigella is a bacterium, but each one kills about 600,000 people a year, primarily children. And again, this is because people's water becomes infected with waste. Okay, so I might have given the impression so far that this is primarily a problem with other countries, with countries that are poor. You might imagine that the United States has a really good record with regards to our freshwater supply. So I'm going to share with you some examples where we have really messed things up. So even a rich country like the United States can make really serious mistakes. Maybe some of you are aware of this, but in 2014, the state government of Michigan, it forced the people of Flint, Michigan, to shift their water supply from using water from Lake Huron to using the cheaper water from the Flint River. And you might think, well, how did they do that? They actually overrode the people of Flint, Michigan's ability to make democratic decisions. They kicked out all their democratically elected local leaders, and they instituted emergency managers that made all the decisions for them. And they forced them to use Flint River water. And they broke environmental laws. It was on the books by the EPA that if you use river water, you have to treat it, because river water is more corrosive, it's more acidic than lake water is. So you have to add chemicals to it in order so that it doesn't eat through the lining of pipes. And that's exactly what happened. They didn't add the chemicals, even though they were legally required to. And the river water ate through the pipes. The pipes were lined with lead. And as a result, the people of Flint, Michigan became exposed to high amounts of lead. So you can see this graph here. This is showing the amount of lead in the water supply. This is when they switched to using Flint River. The amount of lead in people's bloodstream went way up. And then once they found out what was going on, people were more careful, and they went back to their normal water, and the amount of lead went down. So this was a pretty bad mistake. Thousands of Flint children were poisoned with lead. According to one study, it was 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 children. And lead is really bad. It causes a lot of health problems, especially in children, including impaired development and brain damage. So this was a huge disaster for Flint, Michigan. Here's another example from Louisiana. Between 2011 and 2018, a lot of parishes, regions in Louisiana had their drinking water supply contaminated with a brain-eating protist, which is commonly called a brain-eating amoeba. Although in defense of amoebas, it's not an amoeba. In fact, we're as closely related to this guy as an amoeba would be. So I don't want to disparage amoebas. But it was a brain-eating protist, and the state government knew this. It found this parasite in the water supply of all of these regions that are filled in, but it downplayed the risks. When they found out, they told people, you can still take a shower in it. You can still drink it, because for this parasite to infect someone, it has to go in your nose. If it goes in your nose, it'll go to your brain, and there's no treatment, and almost everybody who gets it dies. But they said, well, if you drink it, you're not getting it in your nose. But what if you're drinking it and then someone makes you laugh, or you're drinking it and you cough or you choke? You might get it in your nose. And if you're taking a shower, all you have to do is put your head up, and then suddenly you're on the path to die. Like, I feel like the government should have taken this a lot more seriously and given alternative water for all infected areas. This is from the Louisiana website right now. I pulled this. They say people cannot be infected with this parasite by drinking water, which is true as long as everything works out okay. But I think the people who wrote this wouldn't want to drink water that they knew had this parasite in it, because it's too risky that if something happens and you spill it, you drink it the wrong way, some of it goes in your nose, and then you're dead and no one can save you. And 3 people did die during this period from this infection within Louisiana. Another example comes from Jackson, Mississippi. Maybe some of you know this. This happened just a couple of years ago. For a while there, the state government knew that the drinking water infrastructure, the water treatment plants, needed to be repaired. They needed to be replaced, but they didn't do anything about it. And then in August 2022, the water treatment facilities failed entirely. And for more than a month, 150,000 people in the capital of Mississippi had to live without access to clean water. And they had to boil their tap water for use. They were under boil orders, but this is what their tap water looked like on the right. So I think even if you boil that, that's not necessarily safe to drink. And they did have a few distribution points where people could go and collect bottled water, but the state didn't have that many. So a lot of charities, a lot of nonprofits had to chip in. So this is actually a nonprofit distributing water to people in Jackson. And even with all of this help from charities, the people of Jackson, Mississippi still spent millions of dollars in total on water bottles because of the mistake of their state government. So just as an aside, I don't want to make too much out of this. All of these examples I went through are cases where the states were led by Republican leaderships, and they were all dealing with health and safety crises in regions that were predominantly African American. So these were the governors, and this is the racial distribution of Flint, Michigan, Jackson, predominantly African American, Flint, predominantly African American. This is one of the parishes that had the parasite, mostly African American. So not to draw too much of a conclusion here, but this is true. So what can we learn from all of this? Freshwater pollution is a major problem around the world, particularly with regards to human safety, with sewage getting into drinking water. Even richer countries like the United States frequently run into water-related disasters, especially when we have insufficient environmental regulation, where governments don't invest enough in the infrastructure related to water. So this shows us that federal environmental regulation saves lives, and federal employees, federal workers who check water quality and enforce standards in states are important, and they save people's lives with their valuable work. So the work of EPA workers is incredibly important for safeguarding US citizens. So globally, we're not doing a great job to maintain the cleanliness of our freshwater supply. So now we're going to consider the quantity of this supply. So do we have an overabundance of fresh water, or is our water supply running out? Running out. So we're going to take a little 10-minute break. If you have to use the bathroom after all this talk of water or get some water for yourself, you can. And then we'll come back to a discussion of sustainability of water usage. Okay, so we'll just take a little break. Address the really big question, which is, Is our water usage sustainable? Now, water may seem like an endless, inexhaustible resource, but is it? Is our use of water sustainable? And a lot of times I think with business, with products, people throw out the term sustainable as if it means nothing, as a buzzword. But in science, sustainable means something specific, that it's something that can be sustained. Can you keep doing this at this rate? Okay. So can we sustain our current use of fresh water, or will we run out? And even our current usage isn't really our current usage, because we actually use more water every year, predominantly for agriculture, but also for, digging into AI again, but increasing use of fresh water specifically for data centers for AI. Fresh water is fundamentally a renewable resource. That means it's replenished relatively quickly in the lifetime of people. That's in contrast to a non-renewable resource. Anybody want to throw out a non-renewable resource?
Uranium.
Good. Yeah, uranium. That's good. Uranium, fossil fuels, right? Like coal or petroleum does regenerate in geological time, but it takes millions of years. We can't wait for petroleum to slowly be generated deep under the earth. So for our intents and purposes, fossil fuels or uranium is a fixed supply. It doesn't replenish in our lifetimes, but renewable resources do. How does water get replenished? Well, if it rains, water gets replenished to water bodies or into the soil. Also, if snow and ice in the mountains melt in springtime, that water comes down. So that's how water gets replenished. In fact, water is always moving on our planet. It moves from the oceans. We have evaporation. It gets condensed into clouds. And then eventually, you get droplets heavy enough, they'll come down as rain or snow. And then water will flow into water bodies. Some of it will go into the earth. So there's this cycle of water continually moving through the earth. We call the water cycle. Unless we really screw things up, this water cycle will keep going into the future. And that means that we'll always have some fresh water available to us from new rainfall or from new snowmelt. But this is an important point I like to tell my students. A resource being renewable doesn't make it sustainable. Those are two different concepts. As an example, I'll explain this first. If we use a resource faster than the rate that it's replenished, it can run out, even if it's something that does renew in our lifetimes. As an example of this, we can look at forests. Forests are a renewable resource. They renew through the reproduction and growth of trees. Trees make seeds, they grow into new trees. That's a process that replenishes forests. But if you cut down forests faster than they grow, you can run out of trees, even though it's a renewable resource. So if we look at the deforestation of the Amazon in Bolivia specifically, for all of these time brackets, the rate of deforestation, which is the darker line, was greater than the rate of reforestation. So that means that your trajectory is that you eventually run out of trees, even though the trees are replenishing themselves. So the big question is, are we using fresh water at a rate lower than it replenishes itself? In other words, is our use of water sustainable, or will we run out in the future? So something to keep in mind is that as our global population has grown, as we experience near exponential growth, especially in the 1900s of the world population, this has drastically increased the demand for food, for energy, for industrial products, all of which require massive amounts of water. And this has drastically increased the use of fresh water around the globe. So this is showing freshwater consumption around the globe over this same time period, from 1900 until today. This is the world. You can break it down by region, but overall there's been a steady growth. And in fact, we're using as a globe 6 times more water today than we used 100 years ago. So we continually use more and more water every year. I'll just cut to the chase here. We are not using fresh water at a sustainable rate. All over the world, we're using water faster than it replenishes itself through natural processes. And we know this because over 2 billion people around the globe already deal with extreme intense water scarcity, where they do not have enough water to meet their needs. This is what it looks like right now, extremely high scarcity. So the darker red it is, those are regions where people do not have enough water for their needs. They could die of dehydrations. They could die of diseases associated with not having enough water. So we're going to consider water scarcity in more detail for 3 kinds of freshwater bodies: rivers, lakes, and aquifers. And this map here is showing the distribution of rivers and lakes. You can also get a map of aquifers for the whole globe, but I just wanted to show you this one so you can kind of visualize the distribution of surface water. Over time, humans have had a tremendous impact on the world's river systems. According to one study that came out recently, half of all the rivers in the world have been significantly impacted by humans, by damming, by redirection, or significant pollution. This, again, is a measure of water pollution in rivers around the world. And again, the United States not doing too well, especially the eastern half. Significant water pollution in Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, pretty much everywhere. This is showing the distribution of dams around the world. You can see there's a ton of them in the United States, but also in most other regions where there's a high density of people, there's a lot of dams. In a study of 3 million rivers around the globe, this just came out recently, last year, 44% of large rivers showed significant decreases in water level over the past 34 years. So for almost half of large rivers, their water level is going down, both due to climate change as well as unsustainable human usage. People taking that river and redirecting it into reservoirs, into farmland. This is from that study. They broke it up into different sizes of rivers, but for this size of river, you can see more of them are red, which means that the water level's gone down. Overall, the flow of water in these kind of medium rivers has been steadily decreasing over time. This is from another study just showing rivers that had below average water flow, and then above average, you can see more of them are orangey, which means they have less water than they used to, and less of them are the blue color. A lot of the blue color is actually in regions close to the Arctic, and that's because glaciers are melting, which cause more water to go into rivers. So not exactly a happy reason for that. As a good local example of an overexploited river, let's consider the Colorado River, which used to flow from Colorado to the Gulf of California and Mexico. So this used to be its path all the way down here. And that's an overhead view of it. I say used to as for a reason that you'll see. In 1922, maybe some of you are aware of this, but 7 Western US states shown here all reached an agreement to divide up the water of the Colorado River. This is kind of their plan. It gets very complicated if you dive into it too deeply, but they basically broke themselves up into the upper basin states and the lower basin states, and they kind of partitioned out how much water each state was going to get. Eventually, at first Mexico wasn't included, so they took all the water, but eventually Mexico reached a treaty, so it got some of the water too, added on to this agreement. And this was accomplished through a series of dams and aqueducts, including sometimes digging tunnels through entire mountains to carry water from the Colorado River to distant states. So this was a huge monumental operation to use the Colorado River to extend water to all of these states. One of these dams on the Colorado River, one of the biggest dams in the world, the Hoover Dam. This created Lake Mead, a huge reservoir that provides water to many regions in the Southwest, including 90% of the water demands for Las Vegas come from Lake Mead. This is what Lake Mead looks like on the right. There's a bunch of pipes kind of going into Lake Mead with the intake, and then water will go to treatment facilities to make sure it's clean. and then they'll get carried by aqueducts and tunnels and so forth to the various states. And here's a view of the Hoover Dam that created this lake. In fact, some of this water comes to us, or to Los Angeles at least. The Colorado River Aqueduct, which you can see on the right, it carries water from the Colorado River all the way to Los Angeles. So this is kind of its path. That's different from the aqueduct that's close by us. That's a different aqueduct that's taking water to us. But this one kind of goes westward into Los Angeles. And this is really important for our water needs. In fact, 1/3 of the water demands of Southern California come ultimately from the Colorado River, thanks to this aqueduct. So this is really important to us. Since 1922, the populations in these states have grown rapidly, leading to greater demand and usage of water. You can see the growth. This is for all the states. I know it looks like California is leveling off, but that's an artifact of this graph. If you see, it jumps from 14 and 16 to 30 and 60. So California is actually experiencing exponential growth over this time. If the graph wasn't cheating, it would be up on the ceiling. And this agreement itself was deeply flawed because it assumed there was a greater flow of water in the Colorado River than reality. Like this is that line on the right is the amount of water that they allocated in this agreement to give out. And this is the water, the blue graph. That's the water that actually flows in the Colorado River. You can see for most of the time, like all of this time, all of recently, the actual flow in the Colorado River is much less than what they're giving out. So they're partitioning more water than actually exists in the Colorado River. And people know this, but they continue to do that. So the Colorado River itself has been used unsustainably. People draining too much water over time, causing the water level to drop. And this has also meant that the river doesn't actually make it to the ocean anymore, as it used to in the past, because it gets all drained by the time it reaches there. So kind of sad, but this is what the Colorado River Delta looks like now. This is where water used to reach the ocean from the Colorado River. It's all dried up and dead. Most of the life that used to live there is gone now. We know that this amount of use is unsustainable because the lakes, the reservoirs created by dams of the Colorado River are dropping drastically over time. So this is Lake Mead. On the left there, you can see a graph showing the water level. Over the past 20 years, it's been pretty much a continuous decline. It's dropped 200 feet in the last 20 years because of excessive use. It's now only 33% full compared to its capacity. And this is what it looks like on the right. You can see this kind of like bath ring that they call it. This light level is the level where the water usually is. But it's exposed because the water has gone way down because people have taken too much out of Lake Mead. Here's some overhead views of Lake Mead's decline. You can see what it looked like overhead in the year 2000 compared to the year 2022. The water's gone way down. There's this whole extension up here of Lake Mead is now pretty much all completely dried out. A similar story has played out in the other Colorado River lakes and reservoirs. This is a couple of views of Lake Powell, which was another lake created by a dam on the Colorado River, the Glen Canyon Dam. You can again see what they call the bath ring, the level where water used to be, but now it's much lower because most of the water has been taken out. I want to talk a little bit about Utah specifically now. Besides using water from the Colorado River, there's also 3 rivers in Utah, the Bear, Weber, and Jordan River, that feed into the Great Salt Lake, which is the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere, and it's home to a lot of species, including endangered birds, like this cute bird here on the right, called Wilson's phalarope. There's been rapid population growth in Utah more and more developments every year, and that's caused the state to not only act to deplete Lake Mead, but they've also redirected these 3 rivers towards farmland and to new housing developments. So instead of the rivers going into the Great Salt Lake, now they're headed off elsewhere to be used by the new housing developments. So due to this unsustainable use of water, the Great Salt Lake has shrunk by 73%. So this is what it looked like, the Great Salt Lake in 1986. And on the right is kind of what it looks like now. One thing you can notice is there used to be these islands in the middle of the lake. But now they're not islands, they're just part of the landmass. So yeah, the Great Salt Lake is almost completely used up because Utah has used too much of the river water that used to feed into it. So overall, if we're looking at rivers and lakes, all around the world, lakes, rivers, and reservoirs are dropping due to unsustainable human usage. This is also partly due to climate change, which increases evaporation rates. But I don't want people to think that solving climate change will just solve this problem. Even without climate change, this problem would exist. Our use of water would be unsustainable and water levels would still drop. It just wouldn't be as terrible as it is with climate change. We are on a trajectory now towards losing many of the water bodies which we depend upon for our survival. And all of the states know about the Lake Mead situation, but they're not solving it. They're not decreasing their water usage. And a lot of them are claiming that they're using water sustainably, but they are not telling the truth. You can tell just by looking at Lake Mead that it's unsustainable. So far we've been talking about surface water. Surface water bodies are extremely important, but about half of all the water that we use around the globe actually comes from water below the surface, called groundwater. Under our feet, there are huge bodies of water, kind of like underground lakes called aquifers. On the left, you can see this is the map of the major aquifers of the United States. This is what we tap into when we dig wells. In a lot of locations, under your feet deep down is water. So if you dig down deep enough, you'll reach the water table and the aquifer will kind of fill in the hole that you dug. And then you can send down a pail to get that water. So that's what you're doing when you're digging a well. You're getting access to this aquifer. Aquifers replenish when water seeps into the ground and percolates downwards, for example, after rainfall. So water kind of hits the surface and goes down. Aquifers can be connected to surface water bodies like lakes and rivers. So they can, if the lake is full, some of that water can go into the aquifer as well. And aquifers are extremely important for irrigation in the United States. In fact, about 2/3 of all US irrigation comes from our aquifers. And one of them is especially important. This aquifer that I circled here, this kind of splotch in the middle here, is called the Ogallala Aquifer. And this gives us about 25% of all irrigation water in US farms. If you know how farmland is distributed in the United States, most of the farmland is like right here, right above where the aquifer is. So they're just drawing on this aquifer for corn and other farmland there. Because that region in the middle of the United States is too dry to grow most crops without extensive irrigation, which again comes mostly from this aquifer. Unfortunately, we've been pumping water out of aquifers faster than they replenish. And as a result, these aquifers have shrunk. So on this map here, this is showing the sustainable and unsustainable use of aquifers, how much they've dropped over time. If an aquifer is blue or green, it's being used sustainably. The water levels actually staying the same or going up. So these aquifers are doing okay. But if your aquifer is yellow or orange or red, then it's being used unsustainably. Over time, the aquifer level is dropping. Red is the worst. And you can see Ogallala is in that category. So most of the major aquifers in the United States we're using unsustainably. In some parts of the aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer has dropped more than 300 feet. So imagine this lake underground that's dropped down 300 feet. They have to keep digging and sending pipes 300 feet lower in order to reach it. And overall, it continues to drop more than 2 feet per year. So people that know about this are aware that they're using this aquifer unsustainably. And again, this isn't just an American problem. Major aquifers are being depleted all over the world. You can see some cases they're not doing too bad, especially like in the Arctic. The Amazon still refills this aquifer pretty well. Southern African aquifers are okay. But all of these aquifers that are kind of reddish are being used unsustainably. You can see this is a really big problem in China, India, and kind of all of North Africa and the Middle East. I'm going to talk about this later, but look at this big aquifer in Saudi Arabia. It's being used very unsustainably. On the right, that's showing a lot of the major aquifers in the world and their water level, and they're all kind of on this gradual decline as people are taking water out of them faster than they replenish themselves. In fact, according to the United Nations, 57% of the world's largest aquifers are being used unsustainably and dropping over time. Depleting aquifers has a lot of negative consequences. You are running out of water, and that you need for a lot of services and functions, but there are more consequences other than just that. If you think about it, there's this big lake underground, and if you pull a bunch of water out of that lake, you're making a hole, and that hole can collapse. So when you remove water from aquifers unsustainably, that can cause the ground to drop down. It literally falls in, creating a sinkhole. So this is a sinkhole in Iran from the exploitive depletion of an aquifer. This also happens in the United States. Florida has a really bad history of using its aquifers unsustainably, and this creates sinkholes. So this is in Florida. Someone's house was right here, and the ground just caved in and destroyed the person's house. And that was because that Florida had unsustainably used the aquifer underneath that house. Another important example comes from Mexico City. Mexico City gets 60% of its water from drawing from an aquifer that sits underneath the city. So the city's on top of this aquifer. That's where they get most of their water from. But again, its extraction has been unsustainable. They've taken water faster than it replenishes. And as a result, the ground has been sinking. This is just showing you that within Mexico at large, they have unsustainable depletion of their groundwater. There are a few exceptions, like Baja California is actually okay. Things are okay right here. But for most of Mexico, including Mexico City, it's unsustainable. And so as a result of this, Mexico City itself has been sinking. In fact, the whole city has sunk 30 feet in the last 100 years. Sometimes the ground kind of sinks unevenly. So this is what the Mexico City airport looks like, where this part of the ground just sunk in a lot compared to that region right there. So it makes really huge problems for the architecture of the city. There's another big issue with coastal aquifers that are close to the ocean. As you deplete them, they can become filled with salt water. The reason for this is because fresh water is lighter, so it floats on top of salt water. But if you take too much of the fresh water away, the salt water will come in and fill that space. And now your aquifer gets polluted with salt water. And this again has happened in Florida. They have a number of aquifers close to the ocean because of their coastline, and they've been using them unsustainably. So this is one such aquifer, the Biscayne aquifer. You can see this is the salinity of it, so how salty it is. So it's a freshwater aquifer. You can pull on it for fresh water, and then they drew too much out of it, and now it's a saltwater aquifer. Now it's filled with salt water. So overall, most of the world's largest aquifers are being tapped at an unsustainable rate and dropping over time. Eventually, they can become too salty to use or completely used up. A lot of times we don't know how much is in there. Depleting aquifers also causes sinkholes and destabilizes the ground. Yeah, and like I mentioned, we don't always know how much is left in the aquifer. We just know the aquifer level is decreasing over time. But that should tell us we're on a trajectory to be using that up, to completely lose that groundwater for our uses. So just the fact that the aquifer level is decreasing should be enough to make us worried. Okay, so hopefully it should now be clear that global freshwater pollution and scarcity is a huge problem that we need to address. Climate change makes this problem even worse because most of the world is expected to become hotter and drier. So water stresses will get worse. Right now, we don't have a ton of water stress in the United States, but it's expected to become more serious by 2040. There'll be extreme water scarcity throughout a lot of Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, China, India, Australia, a large portion of the world. Most areas are expected to become drier as time goes on because of climate change. The few exceptions are regions close to the poles, where ice and snow will melt and make these kind of nice places to live. But for most of the planet, we're expected to become hotter and drier than we are now. If we lose freshwater supplies going forward, this will lead to crashes in food productivity and energy generation, since agriculture and most forms of energy require massive amounts of water. So this comes from the FAO, which is part of the United Nations. This just shows you how much output you can get from cereals if you have a lot of water. So if you have sufficient water, you can get really high productivity. But if water becomes very scarce, your productivity can go way down. It could be 1/8 of what you would have normally. Or if you have not nearly enough water, it can crash entirely. So having an overabundance of water is necessary for this high output of agriculture that we're used to. And just to show you the water demands of different forms of energy, hydropower, hydroelectric power, of course, uses a ton of water, but everything else uses quite a bit. Nuclear, fossil fuels, geothermal, solar, all use quite a bit of water. The only exception is wind. Wind doesn't use very much water. But all the other forms of energy require massive amounts of water to function. Because a lot of them are basically using steam power anyway. So before looking at what will help us in this situation, I'm going to first talk about solutions that I don't think will actually help that much, to kind of get them out of the way. Climate change makes our water situation worse, but it's not really the primary cause. The primary cause is using water at a rate greater than it replenishes itself. It's still a good idea to solve climate change, but that would be insufficient for fixing our water supply problem. Like in this example from the Colorado River, we are just taking too much water out of it, even if climate change did not exist. Alternative forms of energy are a good idea, which I hope to expand upon if I do a part 2 of this talk specifically on energy. But most of them, besides wind, again, use a lot of water. So that won't help that much to switch to alternative forms of energy. A lot of people will talk about beef. And it is true, beef does take a lot of water to produce. It takes 1,800 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat. So what if people just became vegetarian or vegan? Would that solve the global water crisis? Well, in truth, it's complicated. For one reason, although beef is extremely kind of greedy on its water usage, pork and chicken are not that much. There's beef, there's pork, and there's chicken. Chicken is pretty efficient with regards to water usage. Also, there are foods that require more water to produce than beef, like chocolate and coffee. So chocolate and coffee beans both take significantly more amounts of water to produce per pound than beef does. And a lot of fruits and vegetables require more water than chicken, like nuts, lentils, beans, millet, spices, tea leaves, and vegetable oils all require more water to produce than chicken does. And also, it's complicated because milk itself is very water efficient. Like milk is pretty good. So if you had cows and used them primarily for milk until they didn't produce milk anymore, that actually wouldn't be a bad way of using water. But you can see this is a comparison of the water footprint of different types of foods. You can see chicken actually isn't that bad compared to some fruits and vegetables. So it's more complicated than just getting rid of meat entirely. It is true, though, that reducing beef consumption would likely reduce our overall water usage, but would people be willing to eat a diet of just potatoes and cabbages? Because those are kind of like the most efficient diets with respect to water. You could have tomatoes, cabbages, and potatoes as your diet. And you can't have chocolate or coffee because, again, those require more water than even beef does. And again, it's complicated because 90% of the water used by cows is actually rainwater. It's just water that comes from rain onto crops. Most parts of the world don't have factory farms. They just have grazing cows to get their water from rainfall. So that also complicates the savings from avoiding beef. Probably the most commonly cited solution to solve the global water crisis is to do our part, to conserve water in our own lives by using low flow showers and toilets, or by turning off the tap while we brush our teeth. Being smart with water and not wasting it is a good idea, and we should encourage that, but that won't solve our global crisis. In the US, for example, domestic use of water counts for only 1% of total usage. Here's freshwater withdrawals, and there's domestic use of water. So reducing this won't really change the big picture that much. Also, if you look at water usage per person, the United States isn't actually that bad. We actually use less water per person than Australia does. We're similar to a lot of other countries in the world. Canada uses more water per person than we do for domestics. One major proposed solution for solving the water crisis is desalination, turning salt water into drinkable fresh water. There are different ways of doing this. One way is to kind of like boil the water, but you can also force the water under high pressure through a membrane that separates the salt from the water, which is called reverse osmosis. Okay? But it's very energy intensive to do this. A lot of countries have already invested in desalination plants, especially in regions like the Middle East, where their population size has outpaced their local water supply. You can see a number of desalination plants here in the Middle East. These are the biggest users of desalination. Saudi Arabia, #1. United States is also a big producer of desalinated water. So Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, and Israel all get most of their water supply from desalination. So they use salt water to create the fresh water that they need. But due to the effort involved, desalination water is about twice as expensive as normal water, and it uses a lot of energy, about 4 times as much as traditional methods. Here's some different ways you can get water. That's seawater desalination there. This is if you use your local groundwater or surface water doesn't use very much energy at all, comparatively, and is way less expensive. Desalination also has a lot of problems associated with it. When they take water, salt water in, a lot of times they'll kill anything that they bring in processing that salt water, which will kill larvae of large animals, it'll kill eggs, it'll kill microscopic organisms. And also, they eventually will inject that really salty water back into the ocean, the waste product, which can have chemicals added to it that are used to treat the water. So there's a lot of environmental damage associated with desalination. Right now, desalination is not growing rapidly enough to meet demand, especially given the loss of aquifers and surface water. So we have the current trend of growth of desalination compared to how much desalination would have to grow to make up for the loss of other forms of water. So right now, it's not growing fast enough to make up for losses in surface water. But more importantly, should we rely more on desalination? In that case, you're tying your water supply to energy, to a process that requires a lot of energy and infrastructure in order to produce water. Is that the future that we want? In the case of Saudi Arabia, they're relying a ton on desalination, and yet that's not helping the state of their aquifer here. It's dropping a lot over time. So it's not saving their groundwater that they're relying increasingly on desalination. So far, surface and groundwater have provided us with all of the water needs we've needed for hundreds of thousands of years. We never needed in the past large-scale machinery that required a lot of energy in order to turn salt water into fresh water. If our rivers, lakes, and aquifers are insufficient to support us, that should tell us we are doing something wrong. It's not that the fresh water is doing something wrong, we are doing something wrong. Something that was sufficient for our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years now is not sufficient. I would say the problem isn't with the world's freshwater supply, it's a problem with us. Like this is the end of the Colorado River emptied into the ocean, what it used to look like, and now the Colorado River doesn't get there. So it's completely dried up. That's a problem. This is a good time to share a quote that I found with you. This we know, the earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood that unites us all. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. I think that's a good quote to think about. So our use of fresh water is not just impacted us. It's also put thousands of species at risk. We're not the only species that needs water to survive. And the world's waters don't belong to us, even if we claim that they do. So this is showing the risk of biodiversity loss from river wildlife around the world. You can see high amounts of threat in the United States, in Europe, in India, China, throughout much of the world. So by using all of this water ourselves and polluting it, we are putting all kinds of river and lake life in danger. Now, what will actually help us? I think there is a solution to our global freshwater crisis that does not involve investing in heavy development of energy-intensive desalination plants that would put us at risk of, if anything bad happened at those plants, if we ran out of energy, suddenly we don't have a water supply to speak of. The solution that I would say is, I'm going to continue. It would take a lot to explain what I think is the right thing to do. So I'm going to continue this discussion in another talk. So I'm hoping in fall 2025 to continue this discussion in a talk about energy scarcity. And eventually we'll get at a solution that I think would actually work. Okay, so here's my sources I used in the talk you can look into. And I'll take any questions anybody has.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you for coming. All right, thank you to everybody who's come online as well. So I'm going to shut this down.